Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Speak for Yourself podcast. My name is Casey, and we're so glad that you're here tonight. I would like to bring on my guest, and he's a returning guest. He is uh, associated with the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com, an author of the book Enough Already. Let's bring him on. This is Scott Horton. How are you, Scott? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Hey,
There we
man,
go.
how's it going?
How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So it wasn't that long ago that I had you on, and we talked about Russia and Ukraine. And look at us now; we're already in another conflict.
Yeah, it sure does happen a lot.
Yeah, it seems that way, doesn't it?
It's so.
Well, tonight I was hoping that you can kind of reiterate some of the history of Israel and Palestine, and kind of bring us up to speed, and then kind of tell us where you think it's going. But I kind of want to go back to like modern, right before Israel became its own state, and kind of the history of like starting with like the pogroms and stuff like that, because I think that's very interesting. And like the first Zionist, and how he kind of didn't he changed his tune a little bit.
Well, I'm not sure exactly who you're talking about there. There are, 4 or 5 or 6 of the most important leaders of the first generation of Zionism there that had varying opinions on lots of things. But overall, I guess what's to understand is the age of the rise of the sort of mini nation state in Europe, the fall of the major empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, and their replacement by these much smaller countries. And this was at a time when persecution of Jews in Russia, especially, this is where the Zionist movement starts, is, really at a peak. And there's basically young revolutionaries of different stripes all over the place, communists and others. And the Zionists essentially, had fixated on the idea that what they needed was a separate nation state for the Jews. And there were different ideas about where to put it, including going to Argentina or later Madagascar, or, other ideas were debated, but eventually they settled on historic Palestine, which is where, Judaism originally comes from, is, back in ancient biblical times and all that. So they said, well, we'll go back there. And so that was the whole concept, was really what we would think of now as like this 19th century idea of an ethno-religious state. There are very few nations in the world that are even close to pure one ethnicity or another. The borders are all drawn in the wrong places, either because the former empires ruled them and drew those borders to divide and conquer them, or to group different groups together into one nation in order to have them divided and conquered in that sense. But it's very rare that the nation's borders in the old world are drawn where you might put them based on ethnic divisions. But that was the idea. It was to create a state like that for Jews, and particularly for European Jews. And the thing is, there were Jews that lived in Palestine all along. They weren't the majority there, but they lived there, and they were welcome there under the former rule of the Ottoman Empire. And then after World War I, the British got control of the whole area. And the British, of course, made promises to everybody, including the Arabs, that they would control all this territory if they would break with the Ottomans, who they betrayed, and the French, who they signed the Sykes-Picot deal with, who they tried to betray, but the French insisted, so they at least got Syria and Lebanon. And they also made promises to the European Jews that they could have, in the Zionist movement, that they could have Palestine. But there weren't enough Jews, because religious Jews and Reform Jews in the United States, and I don't know what was the state of Reform Judaism in Europe, but certainly the different Orthodox and Hasidic and whatever groups in Europe mostly were uninterested in Zionism. They were, considered themselves French or German or Polish or whatever they were, from wherever they were from, rather than considering themselves as this sort of separate entity inside those countries, as the Zionists insisted that they were. But then Hitler, of course, shared that take that Jews are always Jews, never Germans or French or Poles. They're always part of this alien other group. And so they had that in common, and they did work together at times in order to push Jews out of Europe to go to Palestine. And that was one thing that they had in common there, was their view that Jews should leave Europe and go to Palestine. And in fact, the American Zionist lobby took the side of the racists in trying to prevent Jewish immigration to the United States. And because they not that they knew that the Holocaust was coming, but just that they figured whatever happened in Europe, they wanted Jews not to come to America, but to go to Palestine instead. And so they ended up helping to trap Jews in Europe who ended up being killed in the Holocaust. This is really terrible. And then after the war, the idea was, okay, well, now we're going to have to do the Zionist project and let them have Israel, because they want the hell out of Europe. The survivors want the hell out of Europe. So let's go ahead and this is oversimplifying it, but mostly let them go there. Problem was, of course, there were 750,000 Arab, Palestinian, Muslims, and Christians who already lived on that land, and some Jews too, that already lived on that land. And the project was not, hey, let's just move to the Holy Land. The project was, let's go there and make an exclusivist Jewish state at the expense of the people who already live there. And so they essentially lied. They came up with this story that they fed to the American public, especially, that this was a land without people for a people without land. What a great coincidence. So we'll just let them have it. That wasn't true. There were 750,000 people there. That's like not the official, but the unofficial population of Austin, Texas, including the suburbs outside the city limits, right? I mean, you're talking a massive number of people. You know, the Trail of Tears under the Andrew Jackson administration, when Georgian authorities forced marched the Cherokee to Oklahoma, that has gone down in history as one of the absolute worst atrocities in American history, on par with like the My Lai massacre or something like that, or worse, right? Well, the Trail of Tears was 40,000 Cherokee that were marched from their homes. So this is more than 10 times that. And after that, if we're talking 20 or whatever, you lost me on the arithmetic there, but a huge number of people were forced marched off of their land and run off it under the threat of war, and then forbidden to come home again. So this is the War of 48. Now, the way the Israelis always tell it, geez, they were just sitting there being a nice Jewish boy and decided to create a state for themselves, and then all the evil Arabs attacked them and tried to kill them. Well, that's just not right. It's oversimplified to the point of falsity. Jews actually owned about 10% of the land. And in fact, Zionist Jews, because less than that, because there were Jews that lived there who weren't Zionists, who weren't part of that project at all, but who predated the Zionist movement there. But so they own like less than 10%, like 7% of the land. And then the UN partition plan, which was a recommendation of the UN General Assembly, which of course has no authority whatsoever to take a country away from one group of people and give it to another one. But anyway, they recommended that Palestine be split. And it was like 70-30 or 60-40, but I think it was more like 70-30, favoring the Jews and all the best territory, all the best beachfront property and farmland and everything else. And so, of course, the Palestinians were absolutely within their rights to say, absolutely, there's no way in the world we're going to let you get away with this, and to resist that. And then they were driven off of their land at the point of murder and massacre, rape, and pogrom. It was terrible. It was exactly like what the Russians used to do to them. And they drove the people off of their land. And famously, there was the Dar Yassin massacre, where they, raped women and children, looted the place, burned the place down, lined up the men against the wall and machine gunned them to death, and like the Gestapo, like just absolute crazy stuff, in order to force them off of their land. And the Israelis also made a secret deal. Golda Meir made a secret deal with the king of Jordan. So that unlike in the UN so-called recommendation that the Israeli, the new Israeli Jews, the Zionists, get this part, and the Palestinian Muslims and Christians get that part. Instead, the West Bank went to the king of Jordan, and the Israelis had to deal with him to not fight him for that, because they preferred to see the king of Jordan take the West Bank rather than let the Palestinians have their own independent state there. And then after the war, the Gaza Strip went to Egypt, was under the control of Egypt. So in both circumstances, this is very unfair to the poor Palestinians. But in terms of the Israeli state itself, and what if you just look at a map now where they show the West Bank and Gaza as separate, and what you're looking at there is essentially the 67 borders. In other words, 1948 through 67 borders. Oh, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to skip, but it sounds like negligence. Let me go back and say, in 48, after they started purging all of the Palestinians off of their land, once they got into the territory that had been designated for the Palestinians, only then did the Arab states attack. And that is Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. And then, as I say, that was when they had the secret deal with the king of Jordan that he would keep the West Bank so the Palestinians couldn't have it. But then in 1967, before 67 then, between 48 and 67, what had happened then with the creation of the state was that it was, as sinful as can be, again, with the 750,000 people purged off of their land, but leaving morality aside and just being descriptive about it, it worked. They created an 80-20 super duper majority Jewish state. So they could be a democracy and a Jewish state at the same time. They still had a 20% minority of Palestinian Muslims and Christians who were kept under martial law for about 25 years after that, anyway, under military occupation inside Israel itself. But anyway, they had created this 80-20 super duper majority Jewish state. And this coincides more or less with what most American Jewish Zionists believe in. This is the liberal Zionist dream. But here's the rub. In 1967 comes the Six-Day War, which Israel started. They called it a preemptive war against Egypt to get the thing kicked off. And they ended up fighting Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Again, the others jumped in, and Israel beat all three of them. And in doing so, they seized control of the West Bank. That's the West Bank of the Jordan River there. So when you're looking at a map of Israel and it looks like someone took a big bite out of the east part of it there, that's the West Bank of the Jordan River. No one took a bite out of Israel. That's what's left of Palestine. That's what hasn't been all the way colonized yet. The last measly stinking 22% on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip there. Okay. But in 67, they seized control of all of that territory. And they did purge about 250,000 more people from their homes, but still they kept millions. There are approximately 3 million Palestinians now who live on the West Bank and 2 million in the Gaza Strip, although that's obviously in question now. We'll get back to that.
Pre-October 7th.
Right. So, so what we're talking about essentially is in 67, Israel expanded its borders. And they annexed all that land and they kidnapped all those people. And the problem is they won't give them citizenship and independence and equal rights, because then it won't be an 80-20 super duper majority Jewish state. So they can't have that. When they go, the Palestinians, they want to destroy Israel. That's what they mean. They don't mean blow it up, and they don't mean burn it down, and they don't mean kill every last Jew. They mean demand equal rights and equal citizenship in a way that makes Israel no longer an exclusivist Jewish state. So this is the same thing as if the whites of Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s said, MLK, he's trying to destroy Mississippi, right? No, he's not trying to blow up Mississippi or burn down Mississippi. He's just trying to say, instead of having two tiers of systems of rights for the people of Mississippi, we'll have one. And it'll be for the blacks and the whites equally, right? No, you're an anti-whiteite. No, we're saying you're not allowed to have Jim Crow segregation and white supremacy rule over the blacks anymore. That's not being an anti-whiteite. That's saying it's time for equal rights and equal protection under the law for the black citizens of that state. See? But what the Israelis do is they go, oh, no, we didn't annex that territory. What are you talking about? It's not even occupied territory. In fact, let's quibble. Let's argue over semantics. Let's pretend that because we have these weird agreements with this sock puppet Palestinian Authority, that means that it's not quite an occupation. And let's pretend the UN resolutions that say we have to end the occupation. Well, in the French version, it doesn't say the occupied territories. It just says occupied territories. Well, we take that to mean that you wanted us to get out of the Sinai Peninsula, but you don't give a damn about the West Bank or Gaza or the Golan Heights. Whatever, man, right? They're being completely dishonest. And the reason why is they want that land. And the fact of those Palestinians still living on it, well, you're right. That is a problem, isn't it? We're just going to have to figure that out someday. They are going to have to give up and go die, go jump in a river, or go live in Jordan or something someday. That land belong to us. And especially we're talking about the West Bank, not even so much the Gaza Strip, which sure they want because it's nice beachfront property, but the West Bank, they call that Judea and Samaria and claim that this is key to their holy writ to the land and all of this magical stuff. And so not everyone in Israel, of course, but the people who run the radical right-wing factions, the nationalist factions that rule the country, some of them secular and some of them religious, but all of them right-wing nationalists, they want that land, and they're willing to essentially forego peace in order to get it someday. And people just assume, people kind of project their own ideals onto their Israeli friends and say, well, surely the Israelis would do everything they could to have peace if they could get it. They just can't get it because of those mean old terrorists won't let them have it. But that's not true. They want that land. The Israelis want the Palestinians' land, and they are not willing to settle on a one-state solution where everyone has equal rights in one state, and they're not willing to give up the West Bank and Gaza Strip to be an independent state, the so-called two-state solution, and let them have independence. So what do we have? We have a bunch of Indians who've been completely conquered by the cowboys and rounded up onto their reservation, and then relentlessly punished, bombed and shot and killed, and their children abducted from their beds in the middle of the night by foreign occupation troops, and a totalitarian state, like living under the Soviet Union, and for longer than the communists occupied Eastern Europe, since 1967, which is, 9 years before I was born. And you can tell how old I am now by all the white in my beard. So this is the true nature of the controversy. It's not even just the creation of the state of Israel. It's their refusal to allow the Palestinians to have even their last stinking measly 22% of what's left, or at least under their own independent state regime, as opposed to under this foreign military occupation. And to go further, Benjamin Netanyahu, well, here, I'll catch you up to date on the two-state deal.
Yeah, my next question was, can you explain what people are talking about when they're saying a two-state solution has been tried and offered, that sort of thing? And then can you explain the reality of what's actually happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a damned lie. And the people who are saying it mostly know that it is, although sometimes they believe it and just repeat it. But the promise in 1979 at Camp David was that in order for Israel to make peace with Egypt, they would promise to embark on a two-state solution with Arafat. And Arafat in the PLO, he was basically like a sort of half secular commie, half nationalist type. And he had essentially given up on terrorism and had launched what they called the peace offensive, where he said he was willing to recognize Israel and negotiate. So what did they do? They attacked him. They invaded Lebanon and attacked him and essentially thwarted any progress toward a two-state deal. Now, Carter lost and Reagan came in, and Reagan's guys weren't very hot on doing a two-state deal anyway, although they were pretty divided about Israel's war in Lebanon, the way that they did that at the time. And Reagan famously called Menachem Begin and compared the strikes on Beirut to the Holocaust and said the image of this war is going to be a 7-month-old baby with her arms blown off. I demand that you stop this bombing right now. And then the bombing did stop in 15 minutes. And this is how Hezbollah was created, was because they rolled in there to fight against the Palestinians, but they treated the local Shiite population absolutely terribly. And so they ended up in insurgency against the Israelis and created what's now known as Hezbollah, the Party of God, in response to what Israel was doing there. And then in 1991, after the first Iraq War, H.W. Bush had this really high approval rating. And he and his Secretary of State, James Baker, and his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, they thought now was the time to force through a two-state solution, a Palestinian state. And they went to Madrid to essentially reestablish the process toward getting the thing done. And due to H.W. Bush's disgruntlement, the Israeli people got the message loud and clear and unelected their right-wing Likud leader, Menachem Begin, and replaced him with Yitzhak Rabin from the Labor Party, who was sworn to be more cooperative with the Americans and seek a two-state solution. Because America is their great patron, and they didn't want to piss us off. So Bill Clinton comes in, and just as he's ruining the peace deal in Bosnia and burning all the Branch Davidians to death, he's actually working on doing this deal. And they go to Oslo, Norway. And what they decided in Oslo was not a two-state deal. What they decided on was the peace process that said, we're going to work toward a two-state solution, a Palestinian state. It ain't going to be you get your 22%. It's going to be all these deals and technicalities and side swaps and all this stuff to try to get it done. And it's going to be what Yitzhak Rabin called a state minus. In other words, no actual standing military force. It'll be something like a state, a hell of a lot less degree of occupation than they've been under ever since then. But it wasn't going to be true independence and nationalism and statehood, but something close to that. But then a Netanyahu fan murdered Yitzhak Rabin, shot him in the back in 1995. And that was essentially the end of that. His successor, Shimon Peres, was, for whatever, domestic political reasons, basically reinvaded Lebanon in 1996, which is one of the things that helped motivate al-Qaeda to attack the United States, including lead hijacker Mohammed Atta was motivated by Israel's war in Lebanon in 96 to join al-Qaeda and fight the United States. And then Netanyahu came in 96. The current prime minister was first made prime minister in 1996. And when he came in, his object was to thwart Oslo, to do everything he could to prevent the peace process from being successfully completed. And you can even find essentially candid camera footage of Benjamin Netanyahu sitting in a living room of this lady's house, a settler on the West Bank. And the kid was supposed to turn the video camera off. And he either turned it back on deliberately or he thought he turned it off or something. But Netanyahu thinks the camera is off. And he goes on and on. You can find this on YouTube. I know there are a couple versions that don't have the translations, but you can find the version with the translations too. And it's from Israeli media. There's no dispute over the translations. And it's Netanyahu boasting how he deceived Bill Clinton. Now, he promised Bill Clinton, oh, no, don't worry. I just need these security areas. And then, the security area is all of Area C, sucker, meaning like 2/3 of the West Bank and all of the Jordan River Valley and all this. And the lady says, geez, Bibi, if you treat the Americans that way, might they get angry? And that would be bad. And he says, oh, don't worry about the Americans. America is easily moved. 80% of them support us. It's absurd, he says. 80% of them support us. It's absurd. He mocks America for going along with Israel, no matter what they do. As he's, mocking, screwing over, lying to our president. Yes, I will make this agreement with you, sir. Shake hands. And then he's lying, and he means it. And it's funny because his father was one of the founders of Likud and known as a hardcore right-wing nationalist ally of Menachem Begin, and then from the founding generation. And she's like, geez, Bibi, but you gave up Hebron. And he's like, look, I asked my father. He goes, you know who my father is? She goes, yeah. He goes, well, I asked my father, is this a good deal? And he said it's good to take what you can get now and get more later, right? So he's really like defending his record there by saying that I screwed the Americans. I promised them X, but I gave them only Y. And anyway, then comes Ehud Barak. Netanyahu is out, and Barak comes in 2000. And this is the foundation, really, of the myth that they tried to give him a two-state solution. Well, there's two different parts of it. The first thing is they tried to give him a two-state solution in 2000, but they rejected it. Arafat, they gave him everything that he wanted and the moon, and he told them to go to hell. Well, that's just a lie. And what really happened was it was mostly Bill Clinton's fault rather than the Israelis, because Bill Clinton, first of all, gave them way too short of a time frame at Camp David to do the deal. It was like 5 days. And then I got to leave town. So he put like a real crunch on them, and then they weren't ready. And they had changed the basis of the negotiation. They had a list of everybody's position on X, Y, and Z, but they left off the Israelis' position on X and the Palestinians' position on Y, which sent everybody scrambling and caused another day's delay and all this resentment. And then the Israelis were just intransigent. And, they go, oh, we were being so generous. But everything that they were doing was trying to get away with not just following the law. Resolution 242 said, get out of the occupied territories. So all of their concessions were essentially compared to that. It's like when they say the government they project a rate of growth of spending for a certain agency, and then they make a cut to the estimated rate of growth. But it's not a cut. It's still growth of the budget of the company. It's just a little bit less than before, that kind of thing. Well, that's what they're doing here. They're like, well, look, obviously we're not going to follow international law, but instead of giving you only, 80% of the 22% of Palestine that's left, we'll give you 85, right? So it's like, they're being generous after taking their giant discount first, if that makes sense, And then they didn't even have a piece of paper with a real plan on it. It never even got that far. And there's a book called The Truth About Camp David by Clayton Swisher, where he quotes, and he interviewed all the principals here, including Bill Clinton himself, I believe, and all of his ambassadors and everyone. And he tells a story where Arafat said to Bill Clinton, hey, man, the Israelis are being intransigent on this, and that point, right? And Clinton says, yeah, I do know that. And so Arafat says, okay, well, when this thing falls apart, you're not going to just blame me then, right? And Clinton goes, I swear, man, I won't blame you. And then, yeah, right, it's Bill Clinton the liar. So that's exactly what he did, was lie and break that promise and come out and say, yes, of course, it's all them damn dirty tuberculosis-ridden Arabs' fault. Here we tried to give them everything and they said no. Does that even make any sense to you at all? Yeah, we tried to give them a sovereign, independent state. He was going to be the dictator of the whole thing, but he turned us down for continued occupation and terrorism and harassment and eventually being poisoned to death. Yeah, sure. And if that's so true, then how come they don't give him a state right now? How come they didn't give him a state under Sharon, under Olmert, under Netanyahu this whole time ever since then? It's because that's obviously a lie. It's not the true story of what happened there. Then there's a separate story of, we tried to give him a two-state. And that is the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, the so-called disengagement. Well, they didn't do a two-state solution. They didn't negotiate with the United States and Europe and the Quartet and this and that and the Palestinian Authority and set up a new government there, like in the deal, the peace process established in Oslo. No, it was none of that. In fact, it was the opposite of that. What happened was Ariel Sharon pulled the troops out, or pulled the Gaza settlers out in order to put the Gaza Strip under siege in a way to sort of kick them out of Israel, like virtually kick them out of Israel. If the problem is that we have an apartheid state where you have 5 million people ruling another 5 million people, well, what if we could just reduce that second 5 by 2? And then it's only 5 million Israeli Jews ruling 3 million Palestinian Muslims and Christians. And that feels less apartheid-y than having it half and half, or even having a minority of Israeli Jews ruling a majority of Palestinian Arabs, right? So, and I encourage everyone to look this up, okay? The key word is, it's very easy to find. Just do Ariel Sharon, 2005, formaldehyde. And in fact, the quote is from his advisor, Dov Weissglass. And the term is formaldehyde, which is the preservative that you use for embalming a corpse, right? So Dov Weissglass is defending the policy. And he's saying what we're doing is we're putting the peace process in formaldehyde. We're dividing and conquering the Palestinians. We got from the U.S. Congress a no one to talk to certificate. You're familiar with this, this cliche. We have no partner for peace, right? You go, well, we have no partner for peace in the Gaza Strip. And he says, we got a no one to talk to certificate from the U.S. Congress and the president, that is W. Bush. And what that certificate says is there's no one to talk to, so the status quo remains for now, and that status quo will change as soon as Gaza becomes Norway. In other words, white and Christian and homogeneous and at peace, right? Which will never happen. And he says, see you then, and shalom, right? So it's a big joke. This is a sabotage of the peace process. And then what do you get from Ben Shapiro? Oh, we gave them total freedom and independence, and we get nothing but rockets over the wall, nothing but attacks in response. But they didn't give them independence. All they did was they moved their occupation, essentially their military control, from inside the Strip to its borders and put the place under siege. So Hamas, rather than being the government of the Gaza Strip, they're essentially the strongest gang that took over the prison after the warden and the guards retreated to the perimeter. There's nothing like popular sovereignty there. This is an Indian reservation under Israeli control. The military controls all the borders, controls they have no seaport, but controls their fishing zone. Only 3 miles off the coast are allowed to go, and sometimes even then they're shot. They're not allowed to have an airport or a seaport of any kind, or to travel outside of the Strip. And if they do, then they can't get back in. They're not allowed to travel in, like if they get married, they're not allowed to move to the West Bank or to be with family. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. They live under a totalitarian state, essentially under siege. Now, I only just got this recently. A friend sent me this, and it's you can look this up. The guy's name is Arnon Sofer, Soffer, Arnon, Arnon Sofer. And he's a specialist in demography. And it's an interview that he gave to the Jerusalem Post in 2004, a year before the disengagement. Okay. And here's your keywords for your Google search. He says, we will have to kill and kill and kill. And you can find, I don't know if you can find the original interview at the Jerusalem Post, but you can find reference to it at the Jerusalem Post, including the most controversial quotes there. And you can find full reprints of the entire interview in various places on the internet that are, as far as I can tell, legit. And here's what it is. The guy's an Israeli demographer, and he's claiming credit for the idea of the disengagement. And he's saying he convinced Ariel Sharon the problem is the Palestinians are having too many babies. And right now you have something like a 50-50 split if you include the Palestinian citizens of Israel. But that very quickly we're going to have a minority ruling the majority. And that will be an apartheid state, and the world won't stand for it. That will be too far outside of the bounds. And then the state of Israel itself will be threatened. Now, So is the solution give them independence? Give them an actual two-state solution like in the deal? Hell no, of course not that. But we do want to kick them out of Israel. So he's saying we want to essentially, again, virtually kick them out by so-called disengaging, pretending that it's an end of the occupation, that Gaza is something other than a part of Israel already conquered and absorbed, and kick them out. And he says, this is again in 2004, he says, now when we do this, we're going to be denying them a state, denying them citizenship, and kicking them out of the country. We're going to have to surround the place with a giant wall. And we're going to, have to turn the place into this miserable concentration camp. And it will turn the people of Gaza into animals. And under the leadership of Hamas, Islamist fundamentalists, they'll be worse than ever before. And so then he says, then we will have no choice if we want to survive, but to kill and kill and kill. And then he says, my only worry is for the Israeli soldiers who have to do all that killing, that they will be okay. Right? This is like the the Gestapo talking about, oh, our poor heroic members of the Gestapo who have to live with the burden of murdering these poor civilians, right? That's how they talk about it. And this is now in 2004. So the disengagement happens in 2005. George W. Bush insists that they hold an election in 2006 in which Hamas wins a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality. They don't, in fact, win a majority in a single district anywhere in Palestine, but they do win a majority in the parliament. And at that point, then in 2007, the United States tries, and this is when after Sharon is in his coma and his successor Ehud Olmert is the prime minister, they tried to do a coup to overthrow Hamas in Gaza, which blew up in their face. That's the Gaza bombshell, where Elliot Abrams was behind it, and the coup failed. And Hamas then took full control of the Gaza Strip, and Israel then put the Gaza Strip under a full-scale siege. So they claim all this is the result of Hamas shooting rockets at them, right? But in fact, what we see is they came up with this plan first. This is what we're going to do to these people. This is how they're going to react. And then this is how we're going to have to react to that. And then if you're familiar at all with this history over the last decade or decade and a half or so, we have this Israeli policy. You've heard of it, mowing the lawn. We just go in there and kill them and kill them and kill them for a while, and then we stop again, and then we do it again. When things get too out of control, we go in there and mow the lawn, which means do another one of these massive bombing campaigns like you saw in 08 and 14 and 20 and the rest. So, again, just to reiterate that, in 2004, they said, we're going to kick these people out of Israel and build this giant cage around them and lock them in here, essentially, deprive them of all and any hope for the future in their concentration camp. And then when they fight back, we're going to have to just slaughter them and slaughter them and slaughter them in order to keep them in their pen. Then the next year, they disengaged. Then the next year, W. Bush forced them to have an election. Then the next year, the coup failed. Hamas won total control of the Strip, and the siege was implemented under Ehud Olmert. And then the next year after that, they started the first big bombing campaign of 2008 and 9 as Barack Obama was coming into power and as Netanyahu was coming into power again. And Netanyahu has been in power pretty much ever since then. He had to do a couple of horse trade deals where some other guys got to be PM for less than a year there, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett. But essentially Netanyahu has been in charge since then. And he's had this policy, and this is my most recent article at antiwar.com. It's called Netanyahu's Support for Hamas Backfired. And it's about
I was waiting for an opening to ask you about that.
There you go.
Because if you run in libertarian circles, it's pretty common knowledge at this point about what you're going to say, but it's not common knowledge to a lot of other people.
Yeah. Well, so Again, people are very ignorant about this subject, and they project a lot of their own virtues onto the Israelis where they don't deserve it. People just assume the best of them. Of course, they'd want peace if they could get it. No, they want that land, and they're willing to suffer through violent conflict for the long term, even if that's what it takes to get that West Bank, especially. So the Netanyahu doctrine was essentially to sabotage the Palestinians by making deals with the Sunni kings. And you hear pro-Trump factions, they love to crow about Trump's great peace deals, the Abraham Accords. Well, the Abraham Accords were part of the Netanyahu doctrine. And essentially what had happened was the Sunni kings had said, we won't make permanent normalized relations with Israel until the Palestinians get justice, either citizenship or an independent state. And until then, we won't officially normalize with Israel. So Netanyahu and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, they figured out that, well, these kings all have a price, right? So for Bahrain, they get F-16s. For UAE, they get F-35s. For Sudan, they get debt forgiveness. And for Morocco, they get American recognition of their seizure of northern Western Sahara, which is completely illegal, but whatever. And Trump also guaranteed and recognized Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights that belong to Syria. But these are the bribes for Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Morocco to sign these Abraham Accords. And they were working on Saudi Arabia. And so these normalized relations with Israel, which all other things being equal would be fine. But again, what we're talking about really here is they're throwing the Palestinians under the bus. And they're telling the Palestinians that you get nothing. Now, the other half of this Netanyahu doctrine was to prevent pressure from America, the European Union, and or any liberals in Israeli politics, although there's not much of a Labor Party or anything left on the left there at all at this point. But in order to neutralize any pressure for them to live up to their previous agreements and allow the establishment of an independent state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they wanted to keep Hamas empowered in Gaza. That way they can say to you, hey man, you don't expect us to deal with these kooks. And then you go, well, actually, no, I don't, right? This is Hamas. These guys are terrorists. They killed kids and this and that. And so therefore, no, I don't expect you to deal with them. You have no partner for peace, right? As Dov Weissglass says, we have a no one to talk to certificate, right? And we got one from the Americans. And as long as Hamas is in charge of Gaza, then the pressure for them to deal with the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank to establish a Palestinian state is relieved. And I have the quotes in that article. If people just go to antiwar.com/Scott. You'll see I collect these quotes like Matchbox cars. And so, like, I don't care who your right-wing uncle is. I win this argument. I got quote after quote after quote after quote after quote of Benjamin Netanyahu and all of his buddies saying, this is how we prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. We keep Hamas empowered in Gaza. Get it? Roger, 10-4, read me. That's the deal. This is the page. Get on it with us. That's what they say over and over again. His lackey says, you don't understand the Machiavellian genius of Benjamin Netanyahu and what he's accomplished with his brilliant scheme to empower Hamas. Okay? Over and over and over they say it. Why are we doing this? To prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And then when the current finance minister was asked, he said, look, Hamas is an asset. He said, you can Google this quote too. Okay? In this game of delegitimization, Hamas is an asset. The PA is a liability. Mahmoud Abbas, he seems like a reasonable old guy. Ask Donald Trump. Donald Trump goes, oh, he seems like this nice old dad type of a character. Well, you can make a deal with a guy like that. Oops. We don't want that. We want terribly ugly, bloody-handed Hamas guys that we don't have to deal with. And so he says, in this game of delegitimization, he says, Hamas can't go to the UN. Hamas can't go to the International Criminal Court. Hamas can't go to any of the international institutions. They won't deal, the Americans and the Europeans won't deal with them. It's great. They're an asset. And what was the other quote in there that I'm skipping? He says, and he says, they cannot go to the UN Security Council in a way that would cause us to need an American veto. Essentially, Hamas is helpless because of what right-wing religious terrorist kooks they are. They have delegitimized themselves out of a seat at any table. So therefore, it's great that they rule Gaza because I get to point at them and say, you don't expect me to deal with them. That's Bezalel Smotrich. He is the leader of the religious Zionist party and is the current finance minister in Netanyahu's government, right? He's the second or third most powerful minister in the government right now. And not just some wingnut from the Knesset, but is a member of the ruling faction right now. And Netanyahu also, and in that statement, the interviewer is asking him, yeah, but isn't Hamas dangerous? And he says, Smotrich says, I don't think we need to worry about that. Okay.
Famous last words.
Yep. And Netanyahu is asked as well. And he's explained to a meeting of Likud party members that this is how we prevent, he says, anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state must support bolstering Hamas in Gaza. That's the prime minister. And he says, but don't worry, we control the height of the flames. Again, famous last words, right? This is this complete imperial hubris. Now, so you see how important backing Hamas in Gaza to prevent pressure for them to create a two-state solution was to Netanyahu's entire doctrine. These are the two halves of it. One, we keep Hamas empowered in Gaza so that to shut up the Americans and the Europeans and any liberals who want us to do a two-state solution. Well, at the same time, we do these deals with the Sunni kings of Arabia so that it's now a fait accompli. Now we can tell the Palestinians, screw you, you lost. And that, my friend, is exactly what happened 2 weeks before October 7th. Benjamin Netanyahu, at the end of September, went to the United Nations and he gave a speech where he essentially said, ha, screw you Palestinians. I win, you lose. No one is coming for you. Now I'm being loose with the paraphrase here. He turns it upside down and says, well, the Palestinians always wanted to hold peace with these other countries hostage. Well, we won't let them hold peace hostage anymore. Well, what's he really saying? What he's saying is we're making these deals with the last holdout Sunni states so that the Palestinians get the message loud and clear. You will not have citizenship and you will not have independence. You're just going to have to lay down and die. We won, you lost. We're stealing your land. Screw you. And then he holds up a map of Israel where the whole thing is colored in blue. I think it was one color, no West Bank, no Gaza Strip. This is all one state from the river to the sea. One country, one nation state will rule all these people and it'll be the Israeli Jews, not you. That was the speech. And in other words, ha, 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 I got away with it. And then 2 weeks later, nope. 2 weeks later, the Netanyahu doctrine comes down in burning catastrophe with 1,200 killed, soldiers absolutely slaughtered on their bases, and then, of course, men, women, and children at the rave and at the kibbutzes and whatever also massacred in this absolute catastrophe. And all on Netanyahu's watch, the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. This is the culmination of his doctrine. We got away with it. We stole all of it, and no one could stop us. But this is where it ended up. And now, of course, Netanyahu, being this absolute failure, after being the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, King Bibi, they call him, well, now he has a huge incentive to continue the war. And in fact, look at what he's doing. He's cleansing the Gaza Strip of all 2 million inhabitants. And he's pushing a plan to force them either into the Sinai Peninsula, or even, I don't know if you saw this in the headlines from the Times of Israel yesterday, they're in talks with the Congo to ship the poor Palestinians off to the Congo. I mean, this is the jungles of central Western Africa. What, to go work in the cobalt mines? I mean, this is just absolutely unreal nightmare stuff. And they're running, they ran an article by 2 Israeli Knesset members in the Wall Street Journal saying, you love the Palestinians so much, you take them. Netanyahu has said he's looking for other countries to absorb the Palestinian population, as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the other right-wing figures inside the government say openly that is their plan, to make Gaza completely unlivable, to drive the Palestinians completely out of there. And then you'll shut up about apartheid, see, because then it'll be 5 million ruling 3 million instead of 5 million ruling 5 million. And so what? They'll have bought themselves some time. And when in fact, and you look how far they're willing to go against Gaza, it's the West Bank they really want. It's the West Bank that they like to pretend they have this religious mandate to steal. Unlike Gaza, they want, Judea and Samaria 10 times more than they want the Gaza Strip. But they got 5 million, 3 million people that live there that they got to figure out how to get rid of them first.
Now that we're kind of caught up to current time, I have a question that I have been dying to ask you, but I want to preface it with 2 different things that I've heard surrounding October 7th. And the first one is that prior to October 7th, Netanyahu was having political pressure applied to him, and there were protests of Netanyahu with thousands of people before that. And then the second thing that may or may not also play into this is that the Mossad had intelligence of the attack prior to the attack happening. I think from Egypt and maybe 1 or 2 other countries or sources, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So my question is, in your opinion, did he allow this to happen in order to justify a land grab?
No, I don't think so. But I do think those questions are very closely related to each other. Look, I have to tell you, we'll go ahead and start with, as you ask it. It's not unreasonable to ask that question. It does border on like crazy conspiracy stuff, but you know what? There's such a thing as covert action. And there is such a thing as governments turning a blind eye, giving what they call a green flag to allow a minor attack so that they could get what they want, this kind of thing. And even Seymour Hersh, the famed investigative reporter who broke the My Lai massacre story and, wrote about Israeli nukes and everything else. He has said, listen, this is
in the pipeline most recently.
I'm sorry?
In the pipeline.
Yeah. He said, look, this is an honest question. When you look at the degree of negligence and the degree of advantage taken after October 7th, it is reasonable to wonder whether they somehow turned a blind eye and allowed this to happen. I have to tell you, though, my gut says that that's not right. In fact, for primarily the reason that I just said. This is an absolute humiliation for Netanyahu. Yeah, they're getting this land, but that's making up for the fact that this is the entire Netanyahu doctrine exploding right in his face. We control the height of the flames. You just burned down the whole damn house, dude. So it just makes no sense that
so it's not a sacrifice he would be willing to make.
Yeah, that's right. It's,
for his own legacy.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, this would be like if September 11th happened during Bill Clinton's 3rd term. You would know it was his GD fault, period. Right? Who else are you going to blame? He backed him in Bosnia. He backed him in Kosovo. He backed him in Chechnya, but he kept bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi, and he kept funneling billions of dollars to the Israelis to mercilessly oppress the poor people of Palestine with, and he got our damn towers knocked down. The Bill Clinton doctrine is a massive failure, right? And that's what just happened to Netanyahu, right? This was on his watch. It didn't crash on his successor's watch. It crashed on his watch. The whole thing came down. So I don't think he would have set himself up in that way just to get advantage like this. But what happens is a lot of times, because people don't understand libertarian economics and they presume competence in ways, and they presume incentives that don't really exist. So, you know, the libertarian kind of critique and understanding or examination of the economics of bureaucracy say that with government monopolies, they fail up, right? War is the health of the state, unless you lose. If you're completely destroyed, then yeah. But otherwise, war is what rallies people around you. A good crisis is what will make your agency. Who needs the DEA if the streets aren't flooded with coke and heroin? Who needs the Department of Homeland Security if nobody is kamikazing planes into towers? Right? Who needs the Pentagon to protect us if they don't go around making the world a dangerous place that they need to protect us from? Right? That's just the built-in automatic, no conspiracy theory about it. It's just the built-in incentive of having a monopoly security force. The worse job they do, the better it is for them. And so they don't usually focus on doing a real good job. That's not really why they're there. They're there to essentially improve and protect and take care of their own agency, whether it's the FBI, the CIA, whatever branch of the Pentagon, or Israeli security services too. And what's good for them may or may not be good for the people of Israel at all. They have, other incentives that they have to worry about. So taking that into account and starting the question over, but from a more charitable point of view of like, forget conspiracy and a deliberate blind eye turned and allowing the thing to happen, like italics, allowing the thing to happen. How about just, how did they allow this thing to happen in the more general sense of that term, allow? Because it sure did happen, and they sure should have been able to prevent it. Well, so there are a few things to take into account. Part of it is what you were just referring to. When Benjamin Netanyahu came back to power this time, well, first, let's go back one step from there. Benjamin Netanyahu belongs in prison. Him and his wife both are extortionists and bribe takers and criminals, and they both are under indictment. And he belongs in prison. But one way to stay out of prison is to be the prime minister again still, and to carry that immunity forward. So it was all important for him to become the prime minister again. And a year ago, he did that. But in order to do so, he formed a coalition with guys who were far to the right of any groups that he would have joined in a coalition with before, including, as I mentioned, Bezalel Smotrich and I forgot his first name, Ben-Gvir. These are two far-right radical ideologue settlers, all for confiscating the West Bank, stealing all the West Bank. And again, Smotrich was the guy who said, in this game of delegitimization, Hamas is an asset, that same cynic. So to join in a coalition with these guys in order to become prime minister again, he had to make a lot of crazy promises to them, such as allowing them to gobble up more of the West Bank than ever before. In the first half of last year, 2023, we're recording this at the very beginning of January 24 here. The first half of last year saw rapid settlement expansion all throughout the West Bank and the provocation of many fights over the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem and this kind of deal. And they were also holding this Sukkot harvest festival that they hadn't been allowed to hold before in the West Bank. And all of this required pulling hundreds of soldiers away from Gaza and moving them to the West Bank to protect these settlers. Well, this same political action is causing a massive political crisis because the Supreme Court threatens to overturn all these actions and forbid them from, for example, expanding these settlements in the West Bank and all this. So now they want to neuter the Supreme Court. So they passed this law. They don't really have a constitution in Israel. They just have this basic law, which is a little bit malleable. And they wanted to change the basic law so that the Supreme Court can no longer review the basic law. and they can change it, and the Supreme Court won't be allowed to say anything about it. Well, this caused those riots that you're talking about, those massive protests, not really riots, but massive protests that you're talking about from especially the Israeli left, or what passes for it in Tel Aviv, trying to prevent this from happening. I guess the liberals, not the left. Trying to prevent this from happening. Well, this also caused all kinds of resignations inside the military and the intelligence services in protest, throwing them into disarray. At the same time, you have these contractors, these corrupt contractors, promising that all the gizmos in the world will take care of your Palestinian problem. You can take your troops and send them to the West Bank. We've got first of all, they believed that they had Hamas tamed, and then to whatever degree that they didn't, or if they're still worried about a little bit of Palestinian Islamic Jihad or whatever, which is a much smaller group, then don't worry. We've got all these sensors and automatic machine guns, like on Idiocracy, and all this high-tech stuff that will keep them penned in. And so they kept pulling more and more soldiers away and relying more and more on gadgets to solve the problem. Then you have just the politics. Like I said, this is King Bibi's brilliant strategy. He is convinced that he has tamed Hamas. They're not going to do anything. We've got them bribed with Qatari money and with work permits. And when last May, I think it was, when Egyptian Islamic Jihad fired off some rockets, Israel hit them back, and I think even hit Hamas a little bit, and Hamas didn't do anything. And the Israelis said, see, we got them licked, we got them beat, we got them tamed. They're not going to do anything. Everything's fine. And then whenever information was bubbling up from the bottom saying, hey, we're, border guards saying, we're seeing training going on, we're really worried about what's happening, they say, nah, don't worry about it. Hamas are just a bunch of punks. That's one of the quotes, is one of the female border guards in the Jerusalem Post. She said, man, I'm seeing they're shooting, running, jumping on their belly, shooting again, jumping up, running, jumping on their belly, shooting again, blah, blah, blah. They're practicing, man. This is like real training going on. I'm worried, and told her boss. And they told her, Hamas are just a bunch of punks. They won't do anything. And I know this from a friend of mine, Daryl Cooper, who you'd love his great podcast, Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, Martyr Made. If you haven't heard that, it's on the early history of all this stuff. But he talked about going there, and he was a missileer. He worked on anti-missile missiles. So I don't know if he worked exactly on Iron Dome or what, but anyway, he was an American civilian employee working with the Navy and working with the Israelis. And he'd been there numerous times, and he heard them say numerous times, Hezbollah we're worried about, in southern Lebanon, those guys are tough. Hamas, they're nothing. They're a bunch of punks. They're not going to do nothing. They're nothing, blah, blah, blah. So that kind of hubris was the attitude that they had. And then, believably, I guess this is the New York Times version, but I think it's probably right, that Hamas began their attack on the 7th with a bunch of drone strikes, little quadricopter drones dropping high explosives on the automatic machine guns and on the different sensors along the fence line, on the various cell phone towers and microwave towers and so forth that the Israelis used. All that high-tech stuff was compromised in the very first wave of attacks of drones that were sent. And in fact, the New York Times the other day showed Hamas footage that they had released, I guess, on their own Telegram channels, of the view from the quadricopter dropping, looks like a little piece, a little thermite bomb or something on top of the automatic machine gun and blowing it up. And so that was how they just, first thing on a Saturday morning, they just completely neutralized the IDF's ability to respond or to know what's going on, to communicate. And they broke out in more than 20, or was it 40 places all along the fence line in a way where, according to the New York Times, and this could just be CYA, buddy, I don't really know. But according to the New York Times, even though they had, and it's the Times themselves who also say that they had the plan, the Hamas plan, in their hands more than a year ago. It didn't have a date on it, but it was the full plan of here's what we do, here's how we do it.
Wow.
And yet, I guess this is believable. There's no way really to know, I guess, but it sounds believable. They didn't even have a plan for what do we do if Hamas breaks out and does like this full deep incursion into Israel proper. They didn't even have a plan for that. In fact, to even research what are we going to do in a situation like that makes the prime minister look like a jerk. You better not do that, right? Nobody wants to take on that question. So they hadn't trained for it. They hadn't practiced. They didn't really have like a blue notebook on the shelf that says, here's what you do in this circumstance. So then that left their response to be very ad hoc. And, there was a thing. I saw a guy was suspicious that look at this footage of these soldiers outside of the kibbutz. And there's like 100 of them or 150 of them or something. And they're just standing there like it's Uvalde. And the massacre is going on inside the kibbutz. And the army is just standing around outside. And the tweeterer is saying, geez, I mean, what does this look like to you, right? They're letting it happen. But you could, again, chalk that just up to government program, buddy. Somebody gave the order that said, our orders are to prevent them from going north. So what does that mean? I guess that means we stand here. And if we see anybody trying to go north, we stop them. If people are being slaughtered right over there, I don't know. Those aren't our orders to climb the fence and go in there and isolate the bad guys one at a time and take them out. Or at least those aren't our orders yet. And we'll stand here with our thumb up our nose until we get better instructions. They're government employees. That's what they do. They stand around and they wait for someone else to take responsibility for calling the shot. Look at Uvalde. In the state of Texas, the law is, and I guess this is across the entire United States, but certainly in the state of Texas, I learned about this after Uvalde, that the law is that any cop, state police, city police, or sheriff's department from the county, any cop can say, I'm in charge here now, and this is what we're doing. You, and you, follow me, blam. And just say, belay that order. The chief is sitting there in a panic. He's not willing to do anything. I'm in charge now. Come with me. And that's the law. They have to follow. Well, what do they do at Uvalde? Nobody did that. The chief himself was there. He was one of the first on the scene. And he said, everybody hold here. We're calling it a barricade situation. Everybody just stop. And then nobody, for an hour and a half, nobody grabbed him by the lapels and shook him and said, listen, goddammit, what are you doing? Somebody do something. I'm in charge here now, not him. You and you and you, follow me. And in fact, as we know, what did happen was the Border Patrol showed up, federal cops, in a totally different chain of command. And one of them, essentially like in the movies, the feds always look down their nose at the locals, right? One of them said, forget you guys, we're going in. And they went in and they had immediate success. They opened the door, they went in there and they killed the bad guy. And one of them took like a grazed wound to the head and wasn't even injured, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's your government security force for you, right? And that's, I think, the same thing that you could say is the absolute dereliction of duty of the Netanyahu regime. They did not want to believe it was possible that something like this could happen. So they pretended that it wasn't. They acted like it wasn't possible because Netanyahu himself, the leader of the millions of people over there, insisted that he was going to prove that he was right. He was going to win. He was going to show up with the Netanyahu doctrine that all the Israeli leaders before him couldn't figure it out, but he figured out the magic solution: American tax money, to bribe off enough of Israel's adversaries that they can have their way. And essentially painted them into this corner, right? Lured drove their state into this trap.
Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but my follow-up question to that is just, what is Israel's public opinion of Netanyahu after October 7th?
Very
because
low.
you have two different things going on. You have the rally cry around a tragedy, but then you have his whole thing blowing up in flames.
Yeah, no, it's through the absolute floor because, as I said with the Clinton analogy before, now remember when W. Bush, when September 11th happened on his watch, he had only been in power for 8 months. And so people didn't hold him responsible at all. You saw him. Those planes came out of the clear blue sky. How could he have possibly known? And in the mainstream press, they refused to even ask the question of who knew what and when until May of 2002. Fully 9 months later, when Colleen Rowley's whistleblower letter came out, was the first time that the major media would even ask, what did the FBI and the CIA know about these guys and when did they know it? Which is just ridiculous and unconscionable. It just goes to show you they didn't want to know the answer to that question. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. Point is, Bush's approval rating went up to 90% with the rally around the flag effect, and Americans just held him innocent for negligence for that. They just thought it's not even been a year yet, and somehow he's so dumb and whatever. It just they wrote it off. They forgave him. But if it had been Bill Clinton's third term, if it had been Bill Clinton's third term, it would have been 100% responsibility on him. No way to avoid that. So that's the situation here with Netanyahu. He can't put this off on anyone. This is all him. So his approval rating right now is 15% in Israel. The vast supermajority say when the election or when the war is over, they want him gone. They should be saying they want him gone right now. They want the general. They've got this guy, Benny Gantz, who was a general before, who could take over, who is, I guess, favored to take over. He could take over right now. They could hold a new election right now, and they should. Not that Gantz is much of an improvement, but Netanyahu is absolutely the worst. And as long as even the frame of the poll question, do you think that Netanyahu should have to step down after the war is over? Right? Well, what are you saying? Are you saying that you'll be perfectly happy to allow Netanyahu to stay as long as the war is still on? Because he'll take you up on that.
Yeah.
If he's, he'll that's right. So right now his legacy is that the Netanyahu doctrine was a total disaster. Well, he's trying to change that to, well, at least I stole the Gaza Strip for you. And I got rid of the Palestinian problem on the Gaza Strip and kicked them out of there and got you some beachfront property. So remember me for that. Well, it could be worse. He could spread the war to Yemen, to southern Lebanon, to Syria, to Iraq, where it's already spreading in small doses here and there. And we're threatening America, Britain are threatening Yemen right now. Israel's bombing Hezbollah targets and Hamas targets inside Lebanon. We've got strikes by Shiite militias and counterstrikes by Americans in Syria and Iraq happening, including they killed the leader of a Shiite militia in Iraq today in a strike. All this could escalate into regional war, particularly against the Shiites led by Iran right now. And all that might be great for Benjamin Netanyahu and absolutely terrible for Israel and terrible for the United States of America.
Well, we're coming up on an hour and 15, Scott. Do you want to shout anything out before we head out?
Sure. I'm at scotthorton.org. I got 5,992 interviews for you there. Almost 6,000. scotthorton.org for that. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute. I got a great group of guys over there. That's libertarianinstitute.org. And we publish great books and all kinds of things. So you can check them out. And of course, the most important project on the internet is antiwar.com.
Awesome. Well, hey, I appreciate you being here. I think you're one of the most important anti-war voices, if not the most important anti-war voice in the libertarian movement right now. So I feel like I learn something every time that I listen to your interviews or I have you on. So I greatly appreciate you coming on.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, Case. Good to talk to you again.
You too. Thank you.